Something just shifted in Washington. And if you have been watching XRP for any length of time, you know that when the United States government shifts its position on a digital asset, especially one it spent years fighting in court, that is not a small thing. That is a signal. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications right now, because what we are about to walk through explains why the US is suddenly backing XRP, what that means for holders, and why the timing of this shift might be more calculated than most people realize. Welcome to Wealth Chain Network. I am here to help you make sense of what is happening in real time, without the hype, without the speculation, just the facts and the context you need to understand what those facts actually mean. Today, we are going to talk about a question that a lot of people are asking, but very few are answering with any real depth. Why is the United States suddenly backing XRP? What changed? What is driving this? And what does it tell us about where this is all heading? Before we go any further, let me be completely transparent about something. Everything you are about to hear is for informational and educational purposes only. Wealth Chain Network does not provide financial advice. Nothing in this video constitutes a recommendation to buy, sell, or hold any asset. Cryptocurrency markets are volatile and unpredictable. You can lose money. You should always do your own research and consult with a qualified financial professional before making any investment decisions. We are here to inform you, not to tell you what to do with your capital. Now, let us talk about what is actually happening, because the shift is real and it is significant. For years, the relationship between the United States government and XRP was defined by one thing: the lawsuit. The Securities and Exchange Commission sued Ripple, arguing that XRP was an unregistered security and that Ripple had violated federal securities laws by selling it. That lawsuit was not just a legal inconvenience, it was an existential threat. It put XRP in regulatory limbo. It made exchanges nervous. It made institutions hesitant. It created an environment where even people who believed in XRP's utility had to ask themselves whether the legal risk was worth it. That lawsuit is now resolved, not perfectly, not in a way that answered every question, but resolved in a way that gave XRP enough regulatory clarity to operate in the United States without the constant threat of enforcement action hanging over it. And the moment that resolution came through, something interesting started happening. The tone from Washington changed, not dramatically, not with a press conference or a public apology, but the tone changed in the way that matters in Washington, quietly, through policy shifts, through regulatory guidance, through the kind of signals that institutions pay attention to, even if the general public does not. The US is not just tolerating XRP anymore, it is backing it. And that is a fundamentally different posture than what we saw even 6 months ago. So why? Why now? Why this asset? And why, after years of fighting Ripple in court, is the United States government now taking a position that looks a lot like support? The answer has multiple layers, and I want to walk through each of them carefully because I think understanding the why is more important than just celebrating the what. The first layer is geopolitical. The United States is watching what is happening in the rest of the world, and what is happening in the rest of the world is that other countries are moving aggressively into digital asset infrastructure. China has a central bank digital currency. The European Union is building regulatory frameworks that are more favorable to crypto innovation than what exists in the US right now. Emerging markets are adopting blockchain-based payment systems because their existing financial infrastructure is not efficient enough to compete globally. And the United States is starting to recognize that if it does not create an environment where digital asset innovation can happen domestically, that innovation is going to happen elsewhere, and the US is going to lose influence over the financial system it has dominated for the last 70 years. XRP fits into that calculation in a very specific way. Ripple's technology is designed for cross-border payments. It is designed to move money quickly, cheaply, and transparently across borders in a way that the existing correspondent banking system cannot match. And if the US wants to maintain influence over the global payment system, it needs to make sure that the technology that is going to define the next generation of that system is either built in the US or closely aligned with US interests. Ripple is a US company. XRP is a US-based project, and supporting it, rather than continuing to fight it, is a way for the US to stay relevant in a conversation that is increasingly being driven by actors outside its borders. The second layer is economic. The US financial system is under stress. I am not going to say this lightly because I do not want to sound alarmist, but the reality is that the traditional banking system is dealing with problems that are not going away. Interest rate stress, liquidity constraints, credit exposure that is starting to look worse than it did a year ago. And one of the ways to relieve some of that stress is to create alternative pathways for capital to move. pathways that do not rely entirely on the traditional banking infrastructure. XRP represents one of those pathways. It is not a replacement for the banking system, but it is a complement to it. It is a way for money to move across borders without requiring multiple intermediary banks, without requiring days of settlement time, without requiring the kind of infrastructure that is expensive to maintain and vulnerable to the kinds of stress the system is currently experiencing. By backing XRP, by creating regulatory clarity around it, by signaling to institutions that it is safe to use, the US is effectively giving itself an economic release valve. It is creating an alternative that can absorb some of the pressure that the traditional system is struggling to handle. And that makes sense if you are looking at this from the perspective of someone who is trying to manage systemic risk. You do not put all your eggs in one basket. You create redundancy. You create alternatives. And XRP, with its regulatory clarity and its proven technology, is one of those alternatives. The third layer is regulatory momentum. Once the SEC lawsuit resolved, the question for regulators was not whether to continue fighting XRP, but how to integrate it into the existing framework. And the truth is, once you start down that path, it is very hard to reverse course. Regulatory agencies do not like to admit they were wrong. They do not like to acknowledge that they spent years and millions of dollars pursuing a case that ultimately did not achieve its objective. But they also do not like prolonged uncertainty, because uncertainty creates instability. So the path of least resistance, once the lawsuit was resolved, was to move toward clarity rather than to continue fighting. And clarity in this context means treating XRP as a legitimate digital asset that can be used within a regulated framework, which is exactly what the US is now doing. Now, I want to be very clear about what this support actually looks like, because I think there is a risk of overstating it. The US is not promoting XRP. It is not telling people to buy it. It is not making it a reserve asset or integrating it into government operations. What it is doing is creating an environment where institutions can use it without fear of enforcement action, where exchanges can list it without worrying about being sued, where developers can build on it without constantly looking over their shoulders. That is what regulatory backing looks like in practice. It is not cheerleading, it is permission. And permission in a market that has been starved for it is extraordinarily valuable. The timing of this shift is also worth paying attention to, because it is not random. The US is backing XRP now because now is when it makes sense strategically. The lawsuit is resolved, so there is no longer a legal barrier to taking a supportive position. The geopolitical competition is heating up, so there is a strategic incentive to support domestic digital asset projects, and the economic stress in the traditional banking system is becoming visible enough that policymakers are starting to look for alternatives. All of those factors converged at roughly the same time, and the result is a policy environment that is more favorable to XRP than it has ever been. For XRP holders, the question is what this means in practical terms, and the practical answer is that it lowers risk and increases potential upside, the regulatory risk that has been hanging over XRP for years, the risk that the US would ultimately decide it could not operate in its jurisdiction. That risk is now materially lower, not zero. Nothing in this market is ever zero risk, but lower. And when risk goes down, the price that rational actors are willing to pay goes up. That is basic market mechanics. The other practical implication is that institutional adoption becomes more likely. Institutions care about regulatory clarity more than almost anything else. They care about it more than technology. They care about it more than narrative. They care about it because their entire risk management framework is built around regulatory compliance. And they cannot move forward with something that does not have clear regulatory status. XRP now has that status, and the US backing it, even in the limited permission-granting way that it is backing it, gives institutions the cover they need to start integrating it into their operations. That does not mean every institution is going to adopt XRP tomorrow. Institutional adoption is a slow process. It involves committees and approvals and pilot programs and risk assessments, but the process has now officially started in a way that it could not start before, and once that process starts, it builds momentum. Early adopters create case studies create comfort, comfort leads to wider adoption. This is how institutional markets work, and the fact that the US is now backing XRP is the thing that allows that process to begin. I also want to talk about what this means for the broader digital asset market, because I think XRP's shift in regulatory status has implications that go beyond just XRP holders. What this signals is that the US is moving away from a blanket hostile approach to crypto and toward a more selective strategic approach. It is not going to support every project. It is not going to give regulatory clarity to every token. but it is willing to work with projects that have real utility, that are based in the US, and that align with US strategic interests. That is a meaningful shift from where we were even 2 years ago, when the prevailing sentiment in Washington was that crypto was either a scam or a threat and needed to be shut down. XRP benefiting from that shift does not mean other projects will not benefit as well, but it does mean that the bar for earning regulatory support is higher than a lot of people thought. You cannot just have a white paper and a marketing campaign. You need real technology. You need real partnerships. You need to have survived regulatory scrutiny and come out the other side with your use case intact. Ripple did that, XRP did that, and the US is now backing it because it recognizes that the alternative, continuing to fight projects that have already proven themselves, is strategically counterproductive. So where does this go from here? What should you be watching as this story continues to develop? Watch for institutional announcements. Now that the US is backing XRP, institutions that were waiting for that signal are going to start moving. Some of those moves will be public, some will be quiet, but they will happen. And when they do, they will validate the thesis that regulatory clarity leads to adoption. Watch for additional regulatory guidance. The US backing XRP does not mean the regulatory picture is complete. There are still questions about how XRP